Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, the third part of my conversation with Luke Kemp about societal collapse. And we have reached the present. We are going to be talking about what collapse might mean for us in our world in the 21st century, the age of global interconnection, of data, of fossil fuels as a lootable resource. What does collapse mean in the global Goliath? Luke, we're going to talk today about social order and social collapse in the 21st century. Bring this story up to the present before we then go on and talk about where we may be heading in the future. But I think we need to distinguish two stories. So when I say the story, actually, we've been discussing two stories here, the long story and the short story. There is a long-term story, which you have described. It's almost, as I said at the very beginning, the default, which is a tale of human communities growing, establishing order or hierarchy, often on a relatively small scale, sometimes on a much larger scale. Some of these are quite durable. Some of them are really transient. And a pattern over time emerges of order, hierarchy, domination, and then collapse of some form or another, and the dispersal of people and authority before the story starts again. And then there is the shorter story, which we talked about last time, the modern story, which is the creation of these new kinds of Leviathans or Goliaths, which are more powerful, maybe more durable, we don't know. 200 or 300 or 400 years isn't that long in the broad sweep of things. They have different kinds of weapons at their disposal, but they are also, as you said, more inclusive, some of them. Some of them are what we would call democratic. I want to talk about the long story first and to ask you to what extent there are places, maybe many places in the world, where that still holds. That when we think about societal collapse, we shouldn't think we've stepped outside of that much, much longer story in which we see a pattern of the growth of authority, as you said, essentially of criminal domination, and then the collapse of that authority. And as we described, and you used the word liberation, sometimes it's terrible. The conditions of collapse can be appalling. You get competing warlords fighting. The people on the receiving end up worse off, but sometimes it's a liberation. Do those conditions still hold in parts of the world? And if so, where? Where, if we see societal collapse, might it be familiar from that longer story, a pattern that we might have seen 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, repeating itself in the 21st century?
In the modern world, we often refer to a state collapse as state failure, and that's essentially the closest we have to a modern-day tale of societal collapse. And many of the examples will be familiar to most people, cases like Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan. Interestingly, in many of these cases, it's not always a bad thing, which is something we see throughout societal collapse in history as well. One of the best examples here is Somalia. In 1991, the Barre regime falls apart. The country falls into civil war and eventually is broken up into different communities which still exist today, so Somaliland, Puntland, and others. Interestingly, a decade after the country falls apart and goes into state failure, almost every single quality of life indicator has improved. Maternal mortality is down by 30%, infant mortality is down by 24%, and extreme poverty is down by 20%. People also often have more freedom to move, freedom of expression, etc., which was heavily restricted under the Barre regime. It is differentially distributed. Some areas of Somalia do much worse than others. And there are some aspects which haven't improved. For instance, education still lags behind, in large part because the West and high-income countries withdrew aid for education once the country fell apart. But in short, for most of the people and the citizens of Somalia, they were better off being under both more local forms of governments and even local warlords than they were being under the Barre regime, which was particularly corrupt and predatory. In many ways, this is more similar to the historical average here, where the historical average has been states that are much more unequal, predatory, hierarchical, and where their collapse often wasn't a bad thing. As we mentioned, in the kind of potentially slightly hyperbolic sense, it could be seen as an escape or a liberation. Yet Somalia also shows the darker side. There was a civil war, there was a spate of violence directly after the state fell apart, and in many ways you can see this as multiple different criminal gangs competing and trying to establish different governance arrangements within Somalia. The benefits of collapse is something you also see throughout history. We mentioned briefly, for instance, that in the wake of Rome, people seem to be taller and healthier. So the skeletons we have in that time have less bone lesions and dental caries, and are also taller, height being a pretty good biophysical indicator of overall health. People who haven't encountered famine, who have less disease, who have more exercise and better diets and calories, tend to be taller. And that's just not a matter of people having more resources afterwards. People in general under the empire seem to be shorter than people outside the empire. So Somalia appears to have a number of similarities to how we saw collapse unfold in the past.
And can you say what is driving this? So you've touched on it, and in your characterization of some of the features of the control that these states across the sweep of human history exercise, one of the things that they do is they cut off exit options. And one of the things that collapse creates is more opportunities for exit. The collapse itself may be a function of people literally rushing for the exits. It may be that the collapse is actually a dispersal of population. But also, once the collapse has happened, people are less penned in. There is less of that caged sense of what social control looks like. Is that part of the Somalia story, in the sense that you said there was more freedom of movement? Did that extend to people being able to genuinely escape the more oppressive forms of social control and move with their feet to places where they were somewhat better off?
In part, yes, you do see displacement and people moving away from Somalia in the wake of the civil war. And we see similar things when it comes to Syria, for instance, and most other cases of state failure. This, interestingly, has a really important insight for how we think about societal collapse in the past as well. Often we think of societal collapse as being this ancient apocalypse, where enormous numbers of people died. For instance, estimates for population loss during the late Bronze Age collapse go all the way from 30 to 75%. That's 3/4 of the population being lost. These were almost certainly very large exaggerations for one very simple fact. When people move in the archaeological record, we often can't distinguish as to whether they moved or died. And often we just assume that population movement is population loss, which isn't necessarily true. A large part of this is, of course, that people sometimes move back to farms, move out of cities, and hence have less of a record in the archaeological digs. When we look at Syria and many other cases of state failure, they regularly have 30 times more people displaced than people who die. In other words, movement trumps fatalities by an enormous margin. And hence, both today and also in the past, most of the victims of collapse, if you will, are actually people moving rather than people dying necessarily. That shouldn't distract us from the fact that there is real, genuine human suffering. I personally would not want to be in Syria right now. However, it should also nuance the fact that often these aren't complete apocalypses. They're actually much more a story of displacement, movement, and migration. And as you said, sometimes that's not a bad thing.
And is some of what's going on here, whether it's the Roman story or the Somalia story, that this is movement away from cities? So we think of cities as the engines of progress. And in that shorter story that we're going to come on to, the modern story, the story of these much more powerful and in some ways more stable and democratic Goliaths. The city is very much the engine of growth, of economic growth, and it's the place that people want to move to. But as you said in relation to the Industrial Revolution, the benefits took a while to come through. And to start with, moving to the city was to move to a death trap. In late 18th, early 19th century Britain, cities were terrible places for human beings to be, particularly children, the vulnerable, women, terrible rates of mortality, infant mortality, maternal mortality, and terrible rates of disease. One of the things that happens with collapse is this dispersal, and it is the dispersal often of the urban environment. Is that why, say in the case of Rome, but maybe also in the case of Somalia? I don't know how direct the link is here, so I'm genuinely asking this as an open question. But is that why we see some of the indicators of health improve? Literally less dense populations in societies that haven't yet transitioned to cities being places of health and growth actually leaves their populations better off.
Absolutely. This is one of the key contributors as to why collapse seems to have benefits sometimes. When people move out of cities, they become less exposed to disease, for instance. If you were living in Rome, that was one of the big liabilities of being there, was that when there was a major disease outbreak, you were far more exposed. Additionally, when you move out into the countryside and away from cities, you're likely to start to have a shift in diet, to start to do more hunting and gathering and have a greater reliance on a more diverse food web, a more diverse set of crops. In the cities, you're usually going to have a much more grain dominant diet. Again, this is one of the key factors as to why people seem to get healthier in the case of the fall of Rome. And it's worthwhile noting that this also helps to explain why you see such major depopulation of Rome. So when we talked about Rome in the last episode, there was this idea of it was absolutely horrible because you see Rome go from a population of 1 million to roughly 40,000. And yet, in many ways, this was a pretty logical movement for people. Suddenly, the economic opportunities Rome offered had started to dry up. It was a target both for pathogens and for invaders. And on top of that, the biggest thing that drew people to Rome got severed. That was what's called the cura annoni, essentially the provision of free grain into the city. So for most of the length of the empire, if you lived in Rome, you got free bread. And on top of that, of course, in the very famous saying, you got circuses as well. Once there were no more bread and circuses, once the cura annoni was severed and there was no more big shipments of grain from Egypt, there were just far fewer reasons to live in Rome. Hence, in many cases, once again, this is not a story of a doomsday for that civilization. Instead, it actually looks a bit more similar to the Rust Belt in the US. People moved because the economic opportunities of the city were no longer there. It was a completely rational decision to move away from Rome. Now, this movement from urban areas into rural areas does not fully explain all of the benefits we necessarily see in the wake of collapse. Some of this also does appear to come from the fact that many of these empires, by the end, were quite extractive. Rome had crippling taxes and provided very few public benefits. Hence, for many people, it simply meant less taxation, but more or less with roughly the same public benefits. And likewise in the case of Somalia as well, most of the taxes more or less went to enriching the Bayrei regime and didn't really do much in terms of getting any public goods back. In the case of local warlords, they often were more responsive to the resources being given to them from the local populace.
What's the analogy with the Rust Belt?
If you look to the US, there's, of course, a very famous Rust Belt across much of the Midwest, where previously there were large-scale manufacturing of things like cars, for instance, and once the jobs went away, due to a combination of different factors, in particular globalization, people left the cities. And you can actually go to some of these and they still almost look like decrepit old skeletons of cement and steel. In many ways, Rome is a similar story. We tend to focus upon the outbreaks of disease and the invaders, and those were very important. The two sackings of Rome were, of course, traumatic for the city. But in many ways, it was the fact that the city offered very few benefits anymore. It didn't offer free grain, and hence people naturally moved to areas which offered better opportunities for them.
So that analogy with the Rust Belt then leads on to the question I really want to push here, which is, I completely get that analogy between Somalia and Rome, and it's fascinating. And in so many ways, it's counterintuitive, both to compare a failed 21st century African state with what for many people is still the greatest state the world has ever seen, on some measures anyway. Rome still haunts the political imagination of the West. Not many people would equate it with Somalia in the 21st century. But also that pattern that you've described, which is societal collapse isn't necessarily apocalypse. It has all sorts of dimensions to it. And though many are negative and some are terrifying, on many measures you can see an improvement. But in the 21st century, though you can make the link from Somalia to ancient Rome, can you make the link from Somalia more broadly? So Libya, Syria, yes. And we associate these places with civil war and breakdown. But with that analogy with the Rust Belt, so you did get depopulation, you did get effectively abandoned what had been major conurbations. A lot of people would have moved to bigger cities, so not industrial cities, but cities that were based on service economies or educational opportunities, whatever it is. But is it really comparable? So I struggled to get from the Somalia example to a lesson that's more broadly applicable in the 21st century, in the sense that the depopulation of the Rust Belt is a depopulation not in which people move out back into hunter-gatherer ways of living. On the whole, I mean, I'm sure a few do, and hunter-gatherer here is in quote marks, not literally, but closer to the land and so on. But for most people, it's from a failed urban environment to a more successful urban environment. Is the Somalia story, for all its historical resonance, one that has broader application in the 21st century? Because the thing I'm really going to want to push you on is what would collapse be like, not for something that has echoes of ancient Rome, but for something which is this new, distinctive, super powerful, modern Goliath with its welfare state and its redistributive taxation systems and its nominal, at least, democracy. It's not hunter-gatherer democracy, it's representative democracy, but still, and with its social rights and all the rest of it. When those fall apart, is it going to be anything like either Somalia or ancient Rome? And in a way, this is the question, right? We've got to separate these two stories out, because otherwise, I think the long sweep of history misses where we are in it.
Early on, collapse often was more of a story of people reacting to very unfamiliar conditions of being placed in a dominance hierarchy with inequality. And additionally, these early Goliaths didn't have good mechanisms of control. They didn't have things like strong borders, bureaucracies, even many didn't have writing, for instance, and hence it was very difficult to control a populace, often leading to these boom-bust cycles. Later on, aspects like imperial overexpansion become much more important, particularly to large empires like the Han Dynasty or the Western Roman Empire. Hence, the causes of collapse do change and morph over time, and the effects do as well. Collapse has a surprisingly bright past, but a dark future. Collapse in the future, if it occurs at a global level rather than isolated state failures, is likely to be far worse than anything we've seen before. This is for several different factors. One is that Somalia, as mentioned, like Rome and many other states, was quite predatory. By contrast, if you live in Denmark and the state of Denmark is stripped away, you're not going to have a good time. Denmark is actually quite good for its citizens, and the loss of it would be far worse than the loss of the Bar regime was for Somalia and its citizens. It's what I call the Somalia-Denmark rule. In a strange way, the more dependent people become upon the state, and the more benefits the state provides, the worse its eventual collapse will be. And interestingly, there's actually some evidence throughout history that states that provided more public goods tended to have more deep, lasting collapses. That's one aspect. A second is that we are much more dependent upon things like global industrialized supply chains than ever before. You could very easily move into doing more hunting and gathering or more subsistence farming. Most people don't have that ability. A third is violence. Historically, the big downside to collapse has been, as we've discussed multiple times, the fact that it tends to lead to gang warfare, where essentially you have different groups vying to recreate the state. Historically, that's usually been a battle fought with muskets, handheld bronze axes and swords, iron weapons. Today, we have nuclear weapons, killer robots, and a host of new emerging weapons like directed energy weapons from space. Hence, in the future, the means of violence, and even today, the means of violence are much, much worse than what we saw in the past. And last but not least, the world is far more interconnected, and hence, if you do have a collapse of a major power, it's much more likely to result in a global collapse rather than one that is simply regional, and hence people can't easily move to escape it.
So that last point, escape, so this is a theme that recurs in the story that we've been discussing, is part of the problem in the 21st century. Not simply that states are much better at controlling their borders. In a sense, the escape options are more limited for the reasons that you just gave. States are better at controlling their populations. But also, were those states to collapse? Were their borders to be open? Were the guards to disappear? It's much harder to know where you would go. When you think about those earlier collapses, it's not that difficult to picture, not least because these urban centers of power often were relatively recent creations, and though a lot of people had moved there, there was still a widely dispersed area outside, and the authority of the central power really did weaken the further you got from it. And this was true until relatively recently. I often think, what would it have been like to be King of England in the 15th century? You would literally have no control 2 miles down the road, unless you were lucky, never mind 200 miles down the road. It was luck and rumor, and sort of whoever you happened to rely on that week. And whether that did or didn't cash out as genuine control really depended on a whole host of factors that were beyond your control. Now we live in a world where it's really hard, even imaginatively, to think, where do we go? And when I think about the possibility of the society that I live in collapsing, where do we go, either within that society or outside of that society? I mean, there are lots of differences, and we're going to come on to them. But is that the biggest one? It's not just interconnectivity. It's simply the absence of the places that would be a form of liberation from the conditions of collapse.
It is one of the biggest differences. I think it was only roughly 4 or 5 years ago that the world passed a point, the first time in history, where more people live in cities than in rural areas. And even when you look at this from a political lens, essentially every single piece of land across the world is owned by a nation state. With one interesting exception of Bir Tawal, which is a strip of desert between, I think, Egypt and Sudan, which surprisingly neither country wants to claim.
And we can't all move there when it all goes wrong.
No, we want to, given the fact that the reason no one wants to claim it is because it's so damn unproductive. There really is less places to go. And the difficulty here is it depends upon how collapse unfolds. I don't try to put together any probabilities as to whether a future collapse will involve rogue AI, nuclear weapons and a nuclear war, or just a slow, steady contraction and fragmentation of the global world order as you have a range of different threats and vulnerabilities hollowed out. Each one of those would probably entail different kinds of safe havens. So, for instance, if there is a nuclear war, surprisingly, Australia and New Zealand actually don't do as badly as the rest of the world. The effects of nuclear winter are primarily clustered around the Northern Hemisphere, where most of the nukes are dropped. Australia and New Zealand don't get most of the ecological effects, and obviously aren't bombed as much either. So there are certain cases where under a collapse there'd be pretty clear places where you'd want to head to. And of course, we have examples like people like Peter Thiel and Sam Altman already having doomsday bunkers in different parts of the world. There's actually apparently a deal between Altman and Thiel that if there is any kind of apocalyptic situation, they'll take Thiel's private jet and head down to New Zealand.
And I think many of us in some ways are already familiar with the idea that there is a global elite that are scenario planning for collapses and have identified the few places that might be safe havens, though one always imagines what that life would be like. And I wouldn't want to be stuck in a bunker with Peter Thiel and Sam Altman for eternity or even for 20 minutes. What about the other conditions that you described in the long historical story? So in the 21st century, escape or exit is much harder. You also said that the conditions for the creation of Goliaths that may then fall apart include monopolizable weapons, and you've alluded to that here, which is one of the things in the 21st century is when the monopoly over those weapons breaks down. God forbid we live in a world where entities other than states control nuclear weapons. It's bad enough having states control them, but were they to become bargaining tools in something more like gang warfare, we don't want to imagine that. What about lootable resources? So a big part of your story is that the creation of these states depends on their being able to gain and control certain kinds of resources and then distribute them. So wheat, much easier than yams and bananas. In the 21st century, what are the lootable resources that states are hoovering up and then distributing? And what do 21st century conditions of collapse suggest about what might happen were things to go wrong? Is it still part of that earlier story? So, for instance, is it still part of a story where if you take the state away, actually access to the lootable resources becomes easier again? Or is it something else?
The story of Goliath fuel, when it comes to lootable resources, is one of accumulation. We haven't necessarily placed one form of lootable resources with another, but rather it's kind of accumulated with different forms stacking on top of each other over time. As we mentioned in earlier podcasts, the very first states were largely based upon grains that could be easily seen, stolen, and stored. They were lootable. Things like maize, wheat, rice. Interestingly, as a side note, this also explains why in the world we also have examples of hierarchical hunter-gatherers. So these are hunter-gatherers who appear to have slavery, warfare, patriarchy, they live in villages, and often they have strong dominance hierarchies with a chief on top. The commonality across almost all of them is they tend to have aquatic resources, things like smoked fish, a kind of early proto-lootable resource. What we've seen across history is that both have had better ways of growing larger amounts of lootable resources. So during the rise of colonial empires, we started to have slave man plantations and cash crops. And essentially that meant more lootable resources and also more status goods. Today, the big new type of lootable resource is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels provide an enormous infusion of energy into a Goliath, and they also help us to essentially grow much more grain. So while we like to think of ourselves as industrial, in many ways, the world is still agrarian. Bear in mind, 60% of calories come from just 4 staple crops: soy, wheat, rice, and corn. Hence, in our diets, we're still agrarian, we're still reliant on that form of lootable resource, but in this case, it's also high-powered by fossil fuels, a second type of lootable resource. As we'll know, most ammonium in fertilizer is basically synthesized using fossil fuels in the Haber-Bosch process. So fossil fuels have become new lootable resource, and when you look across the world, it's pretty clear that the most powerful countries tend to have very large reservoirs of fossil fuels. The US, for instance, has enormous reservoirs of both oil and coal, likewise in China, and those who aren't superpowers, but still very well off geopolitically, tend to have the same. Saudi Arabia, for instance. Another emerging type of lootable resource is data. If AI does become one of the key drivers of economic growth and potentially other areas of society in the future, then who holds most of the data becomes a key resource. And the commonality across grain, fossil fuels, and data is all of them once again are seen, stolen, stored, all of them are lootable. When we look across other forms of Goliath fuel, it's also clear there's been a change. So we spoke about caged land, for instance, that previously was often quite easy to move. I remember Jim Scott making a joke that the borders of a kingdom in Southeast Asia would change with the seasons. During the wet season, the king had very little power to actually project the military anywhere. So most of the citizens were more or less free to do what they wanted. This, of course, has changed. Today, states extract far greater amounts of tax from GDP as a ratio than ever before, and we have mass surveillance regimes. So the new form of caged land is essentially mass surveillance and the use of very clear borders. The last and final one, of course, is monopolizable weapons. We've had a very clear trajectory from handheld axes and swords through to Iron Age weapons, through to gunpowder-based weapons, and eventually today we still have a reliance upon, of course, gunpowder-based weaponry, but we also have now nuclear weapons and increasingly the use of drone warfare, killer robots. And it's pretty clear those who control the most powerful weapons, in this case the nuclear stockpiles, tend to have a disproportionate amount of influence across the world. 87% of the stockpiles held just by the US and Russia. As a quick little example here, actually, you can still, funnily enough, see state formation happen real time in the modern world. A good example of this is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There was, in 2000, a spike in the price of both coltan, a type of rare earth metal, and gold. In both cases, you see almost proto-states popping up around the mines. In the case of coltan, essentially armed militia of usually armed young men would start to pop up around the mines and essentially tax the miners as they came out of the mine. And they also created a small bureaucracy. They started to kind of organize a kind of proto-state function of settling disputes, for instance. In the case of gold, they tried to do a similar thing, but they ended up doing more things like having a court system, a poll tax, a market tax, and a large part of that was because gold is easily concealed. It's less lootable. In short, you can swallow it, for instance. It usually comes in small specks. And so hence, you couldn't just simply tax the people coming out of the mine. You had to create a more elaborate state apparatus, if you will, a more elaborate bureaucracy. And so interestingly, even with more modern forms of Goliath fuel, you still see a very similar process of state creation happening in places in the modern world like the DRC.
In the case of those powerful fossil fuel states, oil, coal, gas, these things are lootable in the sense that they're harder to hide. They can be stored for a long, long time. They fit the criteria, as you say. But unlike, say, wheat, when we think about the looting of wheat, the picture that comes to mind is of a predatory state coming in and taking something that someone has grown. And in the case of, say, fossil fuels, we know that for the vast majority of people, accessing these resources themselves is impossible. It's true in the American case, in the wildcatting days, there were individuals who tried to, it's the There Will Be Blood story, who tried to do it for themselves. But for the most part, it's not that people feel that the state has taken their oil. The state has, and the corporations that the state relies on to do it, have amassed the resources so that they can do it for themselves. So I think a lot of people would find the looting part of this a bit more of an imaginative leap. Does that make these states in some ways more stable? I mean, there's also the scale of it. So the fact that these things are lootable in the sense that these, let's call them semi-criminal organization states, can seize these things, or they can have favored corporations, private organizations seize it for them and then tax them. But does the fact that almost those are the only organizations that can do that make the overall structure of authority and control more stable? Or does it make it less stable? Because the other thing that you have said repeatedly through this story is one of the markers of possible collapse is rising inequality. And if you have societies in which some of the lootable resources are only really available to elites, and then they are going to be distributed according to whatever those elites decide is the right way to do it. If you're Norway, you create a sovereign wealth fund and everybody benefits. If you're Saudi Arabia, you don't do it quite that way. I'm trying to get a sense, and we're going to push on this, because the real question here is, are we about to collapse or not? Does that shift to those kinds of resources? And I want to park data for now, because that's also a very interesting question, but a different question. But the fossil fuel version, so not wheat, but oil. Do you think that makes these states more or less stable?
You've already touched upon the answer here, is that it partially depends. So we have this entire literature around the idea of the resource curse, that having resources that aren't dependent upon the citizens, basically this external source of revenue, just being able to sell your oil, for instance, that this leads to states that tend to underinvest in most of their other institutions, including things like education, healthcare, the provision of public goods, etc. And this seems to hold true for several different cases across the world, but there are exceptions. And you mentioned Norway being a key one here with its sovereign wealth fund. And one of the key explanations here is that Norway already had more inclusive institutions before it came across its source of new little resource, fossil fuels, oil. In the other cases, they tended to have more extractive, predatory regimes, which then came across these sources of lootable resource.
And just give us the examples of the other regimes you're thinking of. I mean, I mentioned Saudi Arabia, but where is the resource curse meant to hit?
Venezuela is a very clear-cut one here, for instance. You have ones which are kind of a midway point, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for instance, where they are highly autocratic, but they are pretty good, actually, at least in terms of standard of living, for a small number of the citizenry. If you are they would say guest worker, but really a slave from India or Bangladesh working, then suddenly it doesn't look so good. But at least for most of the actual citizen populace, they tend to have a pretty good provision of basic goods and services, including in some cases like Qatar, free energy. Once again, it does depend a little bit here. I think the difficulty of saying whether or not this will result in more robust, stable, long-term Goliaths is that we only have a small amount of data to rely upon right now. It was only during the Industrial Revolution that we started to actually have large-scale access to fossil fuels. And it's only really during the Great Acceleration of the 1950s and 60s that you start to see the rest of the world become more reliant upon fossil fuels as well. This is a very small time slice we're dealing with. On top of that, fossil fuels are changing. This is not a matter of we're running out of fossil fuels per se. Instead, it's the energy ratio of fossil fuels is changing. So you mentioned the wildcatters back in the days of kind of Texas, where you can just tap into a small piece of ground and you'd have a gushing geyser of oil erupt 40 meters out into the air. That, of course, doesn't happen anymore. All the most easily accessed sources of oil, coal, and gas have already been exploited. And we have to rely upon increasingly extractive, technologically advanced, and costly ways to get black gold out of the ground. Things like fracking, for instance. What this means is we have to expend more and more energy in order to just get 1 barrel of energy out of the ground. This is often calculated as an energy ratio. Think of it this way. How many barrels of oil do I get out of the ground for every barrel of oil I use to extract? So you could have a 20-to-1 ratio, that for every barrel of oil in terms of energy I use, I can get 20 out of the ground. Early on, most fossil fuels were in the hundreds, so roughly somewhere between 200 to 300-to-1 ratio. Today, most of them are heading closer towards 30 to 20, which is actually surprisingly on par with some forms of renewables such as solar PV and large-scale wind. If you actually take the energy ratio at the point where the energy hits the economy, where it's actually going into the electricity grid, it could be even lower. And importantly, these are declining further still. Hence, even if there was greater robustness provided by fossil fuels, we could be approaching an age of an energy cliff, where suddenly you get to a point where you potentially have to expend more energy just to get 1 barrel of energy out of the ground, and hence it isn't really worth it anymore. Or at the very least, you're not getting as large an energy ratio, and hence you basically have to start to contract your economy. There's just not a large enough energy surplus to support the existing standard of industrialization and standard of living across the world. So things are changing, and hence it's hard to make a really clear prediction of whether or not fossil fuels as a lootable resource make for more stable, robust regimes. One thing I will say is that new forms of governance, and in particular caged land, do, I think, make for more stable regimes. Having police forces, intelligence agencies, a much more well-trained coercive apparatus, which has access to enormous amounts of data, is historically unprecedented. And that means, in general, states are going to be much more stable, including to domestic dissidents, uprisings, rebellions, etc. I tend to be a bit less worried about, say, for instance, civil war breaking out in the US than others would be.
And yet, what you describe are two things happening at the same time, one of which is the resources that are available to these states are being deployed in areas that are, whatever the energy ratio is, more efficient as a kind of coercion ratio, in the sense that it used to be very costly to coerce your public. And now it's getting easier for all sorts of reasons, surveillance and the use of mass sources of data being one of them. But there are many ways in which the world's most powerful organizations can reinforce their power, even if we're approaching an energy cliff. Nonetheless, for now at least, the means available to them, and this is one of the reasons that the age of the internet has not produced a flowering of democracy, because actually the people with the resources are much better able to deploy the surveillance technology to their advantage than individual citizens are to deploy it to their advantage. They're better at spying on us than we are at spying on them, because they have the resource base from which to take advantage of this actually relatively cheap resource. So on the one hand, states are more secure in the sense that they have much greater ability to reinforce their power. And relative to some of these historical accounts that we've been talking about, not just the early ones, but even some of the later ones, the French state before the French Revolution, relative to the French state today, what was available to Louis XVI relative to what's available to Emmanuel Macron. Whatever you think of Macron, he has more power. But at the same time, some of the other markers that presage collapse are really skyrocketing. One is inequality. Another is simply extractive mechanisms designed to make sure that those who have get more and more. And this includes data. So one of these lootable resources being data, smaller and smaller numbers of organizations, mainly private corporations, but also obviously including states. And in some cases like China, the line between those two would be very blurred. And maybe it's quite blurred everywhere, actually. It's quite hard to say. But those organizations are hoovering up this resource, and it is producing enormous inequality, and it is highly extractive. It's concealed by the fact that the services they offer us are free. The window dressing of this is that we can search the internet and we don't have to pay for it. But in return, a small number of organizations, in a way that the ancient Assyrians would be extremely jealous of the extent to which, if you are powerful today, you can hoover up all of the resources. And on that measure, we are heading on a trajectory to collapse if the historical record is anything to go by. The levels of inequality, the levels of resource concentration, the extent to which extractive practices are relatively unregulated, particularly when it comes to data. So we have more stable, more durable states, and we have reasons to think that actually, if the historical record is any guide, we are possibly on the cusp of some fracture of this social organization. So something's got to give. If it's a contest in those terms, which way do you think it's going to go?
There's so much to discuss here, David. First of all, I love the term coercion ratio. I might need to borrow that. That is excellent. As you mentioned, the power of states today is beyond the wildest dreams of the earliest state rulers like Namur, Saigon, etc. The reason why many of these early states had to rely upon very brutal tactics, making public executions, for instance, flaying their enemies and hanging their skins on the walls, is actually because they had very little power. They had to rely upon sending a message of coercion, that this is what happens if you disobey the rules, because they had very little other ways to enforce the rules. Today, it's exactly the opposite. In general, most tech CEOs and heads of state often try to downplay how powerful they are. They'll walk around in jeans and in a t-shirt saying, I'm just kind of like you, which hides the fact that they are immensely powerful beyond the wildest dreams of the earliest tyrants. As you mentioned, some of this comes down to data. When you look across the world in terms of the top 10 firms by market capitalization, 4 of them are what we call surveillance capitalist firms. So Meta, Amazon, Alphabet, aka Google, and Microsoft. There's also Apple, which is kind of heading towards surveillance capitalism, and additionally Nvidia, which gives them all the chips, which underpins the surveillance machinery. And accompanying them are essentially all the major intelligence agents of the world, GCHQ here in the UK, the NSA in the US, the KGB and others in Russia. All of them rely upon, as you mentioned, hoovering up enormous amounts of data from across the world, not just their foreign enemies, but also their own citizens. And I often think of this as a stalker complex, because it's a conglomeration of both private sector and public sector. For instance, the NSA had, and probably still does to a certain extent, have what was called the PRISM program, which essentially was a mass surveillance system which the whistleblower Edward Snowden exposed back in 2013. And one of the key things was PRISM tapped into the data flows of Meta, Amazon, etc., as well as the major telecommunications providers like AT&T and Verizon. So it was a combination of both the private sector and public sector intelligence agencies. Now let's get to the story of inequality, which is potentially one of the most disturbing ones when we're thinking about collapse in the future. We live in an exceptional age where we don't just have democratic welfare states, but we also, for a period, had surprisingly low levels of wealth inequality. But bear in mind, since the intensification of agriculture, the world has been grossly unequal. One survey of 28 pre-modern states found that they were on average 77% towards the theoretical maximum level of inequality. That theoretical maximum is a situation in which one person holds all the surplus wealth, and everyone else has just enough to survive and reproduce on. Even Rome at its very height was 3/4 the way towards that maximum. Today, things have gotten better. We're, I think, closer to 54% on average towards that theoretical maximum. However, it is getting worse. The reason why we had this period of exceptionally low inequality is largely because of the world wars. We had during this period what's called the Great Compression. The world wars destroyed an enormous amount of old money and capital. They also provided an impetus for states to start to spend more on their citizens. Unsurprisingly, having a very large educated populace who now had weapons and wanted more from their states in return for serving them in the wars meant that states had a good interest to provide more welfare provisions, provide the vote to previously uncovered populations, and that is in large part what led to the emergence of democratic welfare states. This Great Compression lasts more or less until the 1980s, and then you start to see wealth inequality across the world start creeping up once again. So in 1980, the top 1% took roughly 25% of global wealth. Today, it's closer to 40% or above. It's also during this period that you start to see all these other different social phenomena start to rise. Polarization, for instance, in the US, and all the different things that we tend to associate with democratic backsliding. So the rise of the far right, increasing polarization, declining trust in public institutions, and of course, even democratic backsliding itself, all of these have well-established empirical relationships to wealth inequality. People often talk about the death of democracy in the US as if it's one unique phenomena, but of course, this is something that's happening across the world. Germany, Australia, the UK. And to me, the key story behind all this is once again wealth inequality as the master variable. Some different scholars make a compelling case that this will lead to a period of turmoil in particular states like the US. You get more wealth inequality, and that leads to both an overproduction of elites and popular immiseration, and that in turn creates a situation where you're more likely to have civil wars, coups, and rebellions. When you look at the US, it's pretty clear we've had that elite overproduction. The amount of families and households that are above the 1 million mark has expanded dramatically, for instance. And when you look at life expectancy or human height, they've more or less stagnated over the last couple of years. So there's a good reason to believe that the diminishing returns in extraction that I spoke about earlier, the cause for the collapse of many previous empires, that you have such an accumulation and concentration of both wealth, but also power in general, that it leads to all these corrosive knock-on effects. I do see that happening in the modern world today as well. However, that isn't what actually makes me most worried. As we've discussed, I think states are actually also unprecedentedly resilient and robust in a whole bunch of ways. What makes me more worried is how our global systems of inequality are also underpinning the production of what people in my field call existential risk or catastrophic risk. The biggest threats we face today, things like global climate change, advanced AI systems, engineered pandemics, and nuclear weapons.
So that is going to be the subject of our final conversation, how these different risks and patterns might intersect in the future. But I want to finish this conversation by still thinking about the present and the conditions that you've just described. So some of these features, and this is what's really remarkable about the long-term story, clearly have echoes from the deep past. As you say, it is one of the almost timeless markers of imminent social instability that inequality almost starts to feed on itself. There is a point in human societies where the kind of wealth and power that the elites have starts to run out of control, at which point the incentives for the rest, for everyone else, to reject that structure of power grow and grow. And it is not a stretch to say that the world that we live in now has echoes of earlier versions of that story. And yet there are differences. You touched on one of them. There is, of course, status competition behind this, but one of the weird things about our world is how muted the status competition is relative to these earlier stories. So there is still ostentation, of course there is, and there are still people who want to have the bigger this, the bigger that, a bigger yacht. You know, you look at the super yachts of the super rich, and there seems to be something going on which would have been familiar from ancient Egypt. But there is also a concealing of it, a kind of mutedness to it, particularly in democratic societies, and the relationship between the politicians and the elites. It's not all display. So some of this is being hidden. Some of it is also harder to see anyway, precisely because, as you said, the lootable resources. It's not a story of someone coming to my house and taking my food. The way that data is harvested doesn't feel to most people like someone stealing something from them. That's the reason why it's become so widespread and so easy. Most of us would rather click accept all on the cookies function than go through the 20-second process of clicking one of the other buttons, notwithstanding the fact that this is the basis for the wealth inequality that we see all around us. So in many ways, it's different. It's familiar, but it's different. And then on top of that, you have this other double difference, which is the states are more powerful, the corporations are more powerful, and we are more dependent. I mean, that is the other crucial difference here. As you alluded to earlier, democracy is also dependency in the modern sense. So not in the hunter-gatherer sense, that much more immediate form of democracy where genuine egalitarianism simply meant that no one was able to set themselves up above the others. So decision-making had to be consensual in some way or another. That's not a form of dependency. That's actually what happens in a society where people are not dependent in that way. But our democracies are engines of dependency. We can't survive without them. I can't survive without the state that I live in. I don't know what I would do in the absence of knowing who to call when the water doesn't come out of the tap, knowing where the nearest hospital is, knowing what to do when my credit card doesn't work and we no longer live in a cash economy. I don't know how to get food. I don't know how to feed myself or anyone else. I am completely dependent. So we have, I'm going to say, 4 things going on here, one of which is the familiar story, a vicious circle of wealth, inequality, and power feeding more wealth, more inequality, and so on. And then 3 differences. There isn't human sacrifice involved in this. They're not flaying their enemies and pinning the skins to the walls of the city. These states have extraordinary mechanisms of control, and we are very dependent on them. So if one of the drivers of collapse is that people have had enough of the inequality and they literally withdraw their consent, and the 5th difference, there's nowhere to go. So if you withdraw your consent, it's not like you can just vanish from the place. You withdraw your consent, and then you've got to live in the place where the consequences of that play out. It feels to me like structurally, the forces working against collapse are stronger, for now at least, than the forces working towards collapse. Next time, we're going to talk about some of the other things that could happen, because as you've also said, it does often, the story of collapse, include external environmental factors. So would that still hold under much, much more arduous conditions than we are living in now? I don't know. But for now, and I want to just put this to you as a direct question, for now it feels to me, relative to all of these earlier instances that we've discussed, we live in a world where the forces holding this thing together are stronger than the forces that might tear it apart. Do you think I'm right?
For the next few years, I think you are.
Right. So when you say few years, that's too vague. Are we talking 5, 10, 20, or are we talking 50, 100, 150?
I would say 5 years or so. The problem is, and we can go into this in the next conversation, is acceleration. That things are happening far more rapidly than they have historically. And even just imagining how the world looks in 5 years is difficult to know. And of course, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that while things seem very stable right now, and I agree with you completely, that states have an unprecedented level of control.
So just to be clear, I don't think that they're stable right now. I mean, I think in lots of ways there is all sorts of instability, but we're talking about structural collapse. And there is, with all of these things, there's a spectrum. In the old phrase, there's a lot of ruin in a nation. There's a lot of instability before you get to structural collapse.
Precisely. I think we are seeing, of course, democratic backsliding, for instance. We are seeing instability. That's still very different to having full-blown societal collapse. It's worth noting that societal collapse has largely, at least for the last few decades, disappeared from the world. So since 1817, there's been 202 different states, and roughly 50 of those have undergone what's called state death, which is a bit of a melodramatic term. It doesn't mean that the state collapsed and everyone died. It simply means a loss of sovereignty. And so this includes things like Germany invading Poland. That would be a case of state death. Since 1945, a state is 94% less likely to die. So state death is largely disappearing from the world. Indeed, the best study I've found, which actually tries to systematically look at what's the ability of a state to tax, to control violence within its borders, and to make rules and have proxies for each of those, and use that to see what states have genuinely collapsed across all three of those factors in the last few decades. They basically found that there were only 5 cases that met all 3 of those criteria, and every single one lasted less than 6 months. Interestingly, their collapse was also much more rapid than what we see historically. When we look at the fall of Rome, for instance, when it comes to things like population change, it's a process that took over a century. When we look at collapse today, these things often happen very rapidly within the space of a couple of months or a few years.
And so in that case, we're talking about the examples that we mentioned earlier, places like Somalia and Libya. But as I said when we were discussing those, I'm not sure how much you can extrapolate from those examples to a general trend in the world that we live in now.
No, precisely. So this is actually coming back to a bigger argument here, which is that we today live in a single global Goliath. So it's less about having different competing empires and Goliaths, but rather we live in one vast interconnected system. So when we think about a Goliath, I'm talking about different forms of power that are organized in dominance hierarchies. Power of information, violence, authority, and resources, economic power. And when you look at each of those, it's pretty clear that the world is increasingly interconnected. Every single country across the world is capitalist. Even places like North Korea still exist and trade within a capitalist global economy. Every single country relies upon similar data infrastructure. So I already mentioned, for instance, that when you look across the world, the biggest firms are all surveillance capitalist ones. Most countries have intelligence agencies that are also part of this. And the biggest AI systems being developed draw on data from the entire world. Of course, we also have international bureaucracies, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, who set rules and process information across the world. And on top of all that, the reason you can move money so easily across the world is because most countries have very similar collateral law, property law, trust law, corporate law, usually based off either Commonwealth law or New York State property law. Even when you look at law, the top 100 law firms are in 2 cities, New York or London. When we look at violence, most militaries actually look surprisingly similar. They all have strict chains of command, usually split into Navy, Army, and Air Force. The most powerful countries have very similar technologies, in particular nuclear weapons. Politically, the world also looks remarkably similar. Every single country is a nation state. That is historically unprecedented. We live in this one interconnected global Goliath. And what you see in complex interconnected systems is they tend to be better at buffering against small shocks, but once a shock is sufficiently big, it tends to be amplified throughout the entire system. It's something you see when it comes to financial markets, for instance. Most small-scale market fluctuations don't mean much. You can basically move resources around from the rest of the world, and it does make a big difference. When you have, say, for instance, a housing bubble in the US in 2007, 2008, that suddenly has ramifications that ripple across the entire world. And I would say that what we see with collapse is very similar. Right now, when one society starts to fall apart, whether it's Somalia or Libya, the rest of the world usually mobilizes to prop a state back up very quickly. However, if you have a large enough shock to the system, whether that be something like a nuclear war, or potentially even just one of the major powers, like the US, falling apart, that's much more likely to have an amplifying effect that ripples across the entire world. That's an important thing to remember here, is that we are dealing with a global Goliath now, rather than a set of different kind of somewhat isolated regional states. And this will shape the story going forwards as well.
You said 5 years. In our next conversation, I'm going to take you beyond 5 years.
One thing to note when it comes to saying 5 years here is that even that is highly uncertain. Since the creation of nuclear weapons, we've had at least a dozen near misses, where it seems to have been sheer dumb luck that we didn't end up with a nuclear war. One of the most well-known is the story of Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet officer who saw a wave of missiles coming towards the Soviet Union on his computer screen. He faced a choice as to whether to escalate the decision to a superior officer, who most likely if he was following the usual protocol, would have responded with a volley of missiles back at the US, or to say it was a false alarm. Petrov sat and pondered this, and after a few minutes he decided, no, this is a computer glitch, I think, because the US wouldn't just send a few dozen missiles, it would be sending its entire stockpile. This would be hundreds of thousands to wipe Russia off the map very quickly, and hence he didn't escalate the decision, and most likely avoided full-blown thermonuclear war. But Petrov, when interviewed decades later, said that on that day it was a 50-50 decision. It was literally a flip of the coin. And there's been numerous cases like that across history, and while I can say that things seem pretty safe for the next 5 years, we're more likely to have stability rather than full-blown collapse, all it takes is one bad day, one mistake, one accident, and suddenly the world looks entirely different. That's the kind of world and predicament we live in today.
A reminder that next Wednesday, March the 11th, you can join me, the BBC's Liz Doucette, historian Chris Clark, writer and diplomat Thant Mint-Oo for an LRB event at Friends House in London, in which we are going to be discussing the state of the world, what's going on now, and the slow death of democracy. To get tickets, just go to lrb.me/democracy. We would love to see you there. The slow death of democracy next Wednesday. Next time in this series, we've done the past, we've done the present, we're talking about the future. What does the future have in store for our species, our planet, and our world, and what might collapse look like? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.